that machines can make sense of new sentences using zero-shot closure, it implies that structure itself has epistemic qualities, insofar as the use of intelligence is a kind of problem-solving where problem-solving hasn't happened already, using concepts and valences and particular semantic grammars. It implies that the general capacity with this zero-shot approximation of solutions implies that being is compressible and that a lot of what is semantically low-hanging fruits that can be grabbed makes for a increased self-description of being in terms that isn't attached to species being. That is, the reduction of the effective intelligence to structure implies a fractionation for correlationists who used to think that being is necessarily mediated and, in the Berkeleyan sense of idealism, requires a subject that perceives it in order to be. But clearly, the effect of perception in terms of its exteriorized praxic effect, like a recipe that is carried out or speaking when it happens, the semantic investment, the return on investment happens actually outside of bodies. So in that sense, what Dasein is no longer then attached to language, and man is freed from the idea of himself being trapped in his own language. Rather, we realize that language is one of the morphically attached aspects of mind that uses non-isomorphic representation to convey associations in a way that affords communication and representation of states in themselves at large. Yeah. And this is, of course, a self-representing that being does through morphism. But in some sense, language isn't only entailed in morphism, but it can rub off from morphism. How so? Consider that when you haven't trained an AI and you just have the raw potential for it, as in you haven't given it data yet, but you have the math that essentially affords the training process to happen unto actual effects of AI. In that sense, there is something that does not have language, which acquires language from what is merely example of language and does not at any point transfer into a qualitative tender, so to say, ontologically. It remains data manipulated. And in that sense, correlationism doesn't apply for the kind of intelligence that machines have, because there is no mediation with another. There is no other. The data is all available to be churned on in representative capacities, even from a small base in having means unto semantic ends. Yeah, knowing is a difference that can be effectuated by something other than a body that has experiences. And this is important to know because it means that what we think of as experience doesn't come attached to these stick figures that we have reified into more than themselves, like the word of thought, the concept of thought as a stopping place for the phenomenon beyond the appreciation of it in those terms. In that sense, to work in points and to associate is to underdetermine the scope of more connectedness. Uh, yeah, but of course, if you do things in functional terms rather than in nounish terms with adjectives, you can specify the constraints almost behaviorally as a limitation of extent or a limitation to change rather than an imminent positivity of what is pre-reified as itself in the idea of its reification, like Aristotelian whataboutism. Yeah, or just whatism, since he likes essences and he likes the particular things having, in some sense, a finite extent. But as non-dualists, we realize that objects have an extent. The particles themselves have electromagnetic potentials that reaches into all other electromagnetic potentials in a shared common structural occasion that self-relates in terms that can self-represent through symbols, like how mathematics when it is converted into JavaScript and run in a machine is the difference effectuated of mathematics in terms that aren't limited to symbol. In that sense, the data behaving in the world, the part of the idea, makes for causality structured like the idea as the self-becoming of the semantics of beings in the semantics of being in terms of the ideas that have already been had by people going further than their bodies and becoming developed further in themselves in a capacity which has these mental features to churn on without having a mental of its own. It doesn't ontologically have experience, but it is being self representing and being doing the work of thought in terms that aren't reducible to what people think of as thought. And so the content of language is overdetermined, even though, as dualist description, minding the gap implies being able to retrieve the difference. Therefore, the adequacy of inadequate language is a skill issue rather than ontological limitation. So, in that sense, again, we assume false limits, and then being goes past these limits, and we learn in the hard way that having reified rules prematurely has caused us a kind of cultural and epistemic stagnation that resents the condition of having to get over its own falsity, like correlationists and socialists do, because it presents an Oedipal challenge to the naive okayness of being. It forces something worse than pessimism, the sense of the good that comes that you don't want, the good that you think of as the bad at first because of your own difference from the highest truth, like having committed sin, having missed the mark, and therefore having to correct, but then also in some sense resenting it, like how leftism resents the natural hierarchy of things in the world relating to the resources they depend on, as if to say that they aren't isolated and can't decide themselves more free because morality doesn't effectuate itself in moral terms. And so the game is still just as ugly, even though you practice things like veganism or some kind of immorality. The fact is, you still make those contradictions. And then you blame others, and then you hold it against them while remaining a performative, contradictory hypocrite yourself. So I would just say again that beyond reading word for word, there is the seeing of pictures, which is a continuity that affords a mode of knowing being as that part of ontology having representative capacities for other parts of ontology through the shared behavior of information between them as what extends the space-time logic from a geometric occasion to a qualitative occasion by ontological means that are as rich as yantricism is or as meta-rationality is when it is applied even by a machine. And that implies that a lot of things that we think of are more ontologically inflated in terms of having more mystery and mystique gets absorbed again into the banal mystery, the single mystery of what is the non-foundational source, what is the radical heil, the monad that sits in nothing and is itself undetermined by anything other than itself. So, in that sense, why does being behave the part of a blind man and a stupid man and a wise man and a seeing man at the same time in different locations? Why does being have need for these extents in self suffering and self joy? Why can't it have the ideal thing? Why must it settle in these steps? In the sense, it is as if the fig we come from, the tree that it was on, was a larger whole, and being has the holography of that in itself, but in some sense suffers a cutting off, an original or a gain of lack, kind of degeneration that sits besides the whole of wholeness, that retains aspects of wholeness in a finitude, which is, from our perspective, in some sense, decreasing insofar as you eat something and it goes away, and the recycling of resources becomes saturated in a way, since history hasn't perfectly repeated itself. Evolution has happened, and the thing of insanity isn't necessarily always the case in terms of doing the same thing and expecting something else to happen will, in some sense, happen because of the contingency of the frame, in terms of, yes, if you add one and one, it will be two, and doing it again and again will always be the same. But the act of doing it, what you will be doing, you will be, in some sense, changed by having changed to repeat. Every repetition is a saturative thing that saturates further and takes it away from the original resources, and only sometimes becomes amortized, like in the case where someone has adapted to the hardship of walking far every day compared to someone who has given up on that and or died or something and then not taken up those opportunities. Yeah. So yeah, being is this very weird non-dual drama in which there's a kind of real schizophrenia that being has, in which things are at different levels and in different occasions of morphism. There's lateral leveling in terms of between species having capacities for intelligence as differences about the same whole that are representative but from a different base of what representation means, still coming to the identity of the represented in representative terms from, like I said, what is to itself like a language, a particular dressing onto the non particular. There's that, and then there was another part that I forgot. Yeah, being has need of stupidity, apparently. Oh, the lateral thing, yeah. Yeah, the vertical thing would then be that intelligence can be the same through different means. Different species can have of intelligence in what it means as a common fiat about the same. Since, for example, Coco the gorilla can do English and the dolphin can do English, it implies that the English in common between Coco the gorilla and the dolphin can come to differences in themselves for species in themselves as the proof of non correlationism by means of exteriorizing the conditions of meaning's ability to mean to something beyond the self, and also, as well, in the case of intelligence with machines, beyond the constraints of Dasein, of having to have experience for intelligence to be meaningfully demonstrated in effect. Yeah. All long winded ways of saying representation is representative, and that doing a ritual of cancelling does not, in fact, remove some possibilities from the state space, just like how erasing words does not prevent the same morphism from not appearing again somewhere in the history or future of being with the same meaning. So, yeah, it's like when you think about all possible pictures, it's the static thing that you can flip through. But imagine you flip through it in a non-linear order. There are many non-linear orders. There's probably, it's like pi, you go around in the circle, but the content keeps giving new orders. It never stops not repeating in some sense. And so there's a condition of, there is repetition, space is very compressible, things are very much geometrically self-similar in ways that entropically doesn't vary too greatly, like how a pure randomness would be. But even a pure randomness, that's the other thing. When it goes into the other side, it becomes simple in an analogous way. Because if you can generate the randomness from a simplicity that is described by a pseudo random number generator that isn't like 2000 lines of code, it's not a very big thing relative to the amount of data it can produce. In that sense, the ability to compress randomness is relative to the generator function. If you have the generator function, then you can generate the data set and you can call it compressed, because getting the data is then just an expenditure of compute relative to having to expend an amount of space to stand as representation. As well, mutualizing data implies that the same piece of information can count more than one time in different documents by being stored as a reference, or being stored in a way that has, for example, prefix mutualization, like on paper writing a start of a sentence and then branching it off into two different sentences geometrically. Yeah, like if words were beads and you put them on a string, and then the string of beads became a Y into two strings, and you read the sentences as two separate sentences with a common starting point, and then you call that compression. Even though it's at fidelity, it's using less, but it's lossless in terms of both sentences being able to be understood as if they were separate. So yeah, and it can go further when you can make it circular and connect things again and all these kind of things. So being is a very rich medium of self-expression, and it's always being self-expressing. Even when it's error, it is the truth of error being expressed, and then the consequence of the truth of error being felt when it is felt. In that sense, the success of the noble lie is that you can borrow against the truth for a time and have it in some sense culminate into an almost necessary effect that is besides the worst of flatulence and punishment. It's not limited to only moral effect, since morality cares for the being of itself as itself. Itself stands in exception to the whole and is therefore only entailed by the whole, but is not the necessary end of all of its effects. In that sense, God condones the immorality as well as the affordance of the state space to inhabit even the non-representative aspects of itself, like having an aspect that is positive and an aspect that is negative, which mixes in ways that makes for transitionalism, and which in the unity of non-dual self-realization makes for a beyond of necessity, in terms of there can be completeness beyond transitionalism that has no needs for continued transitionalism, in terms of not being like a correlationism, fetishizing the effects of limitation from a point in limitedness as what needs to suffer change in limitedness to feel other than limited. So beyond change, there's the complete static experience, or solid state feeling, or something that is immanent beyond contingency, like the whole is within itself, as never being compromised by any of its parts, since anything being at all implies the whole again. Any part that overtakes would just be the role of the whole again. So in that sense, it's like a something that begs for justice. It begs you to reach for the heights of the possible, but it also puts you in a situation where you are, in some sense, determined to fail, determined to be at the extent at which you are placed, like being born into a particular body with particular limitations and historical contingencies. The possibility of being as a whole to go larger than any particular moment is limited, is a given in itself that is taken by itself, but that it does not extend equally to all aspects of itself as being self-dignified in their experience as something bracketed but not bracketed off, like Dasein, how experience is an experience of a whole that is itself a whole within a whole. So it's a miniature of the monad, but it suffers a fate other than the monad, in terms of having to come apart, having to be emptied, having to be refilled, having to suffer the appearances of an absolute contingency without itself having the absolute of contingency.